Hello everybody. How are you today? This is it. It is. So here we go. We're going to talk about assessment scoring, candidate selection. This leads into homework 12, which is highly dependent on homework 10, among other things that we've done before. But that's kind of the way that it is in the real world, right? Your acquired skills, you build on your acquired skills to develop even greater skills, right, Penelope? So we're glad to see you this morning, Penelope, to come help us out. I think Annika's angry because she was jonesing to get up here too. So let us then take a look at what we're about. The whole idea here is that we are ultimately going to select a candidate or X number of candidates who are at the top of the scoring pile. So how do we combine those scores? And that's what we're going to get to today. We're going to combine scores, and then we're going to weight those scores to have their combination be more meaningful. So, and we'll see that this is a certain approach. There are other approaches as well. Our assignment will be geared to the single approach though. So combining assessment scores, well, multiple assessments typically yield better results in the candidate selection process. We're not going to hang our hat on one measure of candidate performance. We're going to look at multiple measures that we've identified as most critical to hiring the best fitting applicant. So, and that's what the course is about. So this is really kind of the culmination. We're just about at the end of it. So multiple assessments allow us to consider multiple KSAOs, person specifications translated from the KSAOs, to create a broader picture of a candidate's potential fit, right? Not a one-dimensional assessment of fit, but a multi-dimensional assessment of fit. And what we're going to look at in homework 12, right, is we're looking probably at 4 elements of fit inspired by the KSAOs and subsequent person specifications. So assessments vary in how they're scored. We need effective, meaningful way to combine those scores, and we've gotten part way there. By computing z-scores, remember, what is it, hot potatoes, cold bananas? Now we can begin to compare. There are 2 ways of combining assessment scores: multiple hurdles or compensatory approaches. Now multiple hurdles is not something we're going to do in this assignment. Candidates must receive a passing score on assessment before being allowed to continue on to the next assessment. So multiple hurdles are just like that. It's like you're running down the path towards that job. I want this job and I'm the candidate, but if I don't get over that first hurdle, then I'm taken out of the running, right? And we can see that maybe potential qualifications such as having a PhD as opposed to a master's degree might be a hurdle on that process, but the hurdles would be up to the personnel selection folks to decide. It can be more costly and take more time due to the need for candidates, perhaps, right, to make repeated visits for different assessments. So we might have an assessment on Tuesday. We compute the candidate's score, let's say Tuesday afternoon, because they did the assessment, and then we see that X number passed, so we can invite them back to the next assessment. You can see where this can be complicated and time-consuming. Now, it is possible to do it in a single day, but often hurdles really are in terms of achieved qualifications, that is attainments, right, rather than scoring. Or we might have a basic hurdle and we bring everyone in, and the half a dozen people that pass that hurdle then are scheduled for one single assessment day somewhere down the road. It can be more costly, right, because we might have these repeated visits, but we can see where some hurdles really are necessities, and that is, if you can't do this, then you're just out of the running completely. But it can save money when screening out candidate prior to making more expensive or time-consuming assessments later in the selection process. So if we have a deal killer type qualification, we might make that a hurdle, right? And if you don't jump over that hurdle, then we're not going to bring you back for the next 3 assessments. So on the one hand, it could cost you more money to use a multiple hurdle approach, or it could actually save money depending on the nature of your assessments. And that's where your experience comes in and your ability to think critically and make the judgments, right? And adhere to your budget as a result of this. And remember, budgets come in at least two forms. That is money type budget, but also time type budget. So sometimes used when the cost of poor performance on that characteristic is high, for example, when safety is at risk. So if someone, let's build in one of the hurdles is a person's ability to operate safely. If they can't, then man, they're out at that hurdle, and that's the end of the story. Now we're going to talk more about compensatory approaches here. High scores on some assessments may compensate for low scores on other assessments. So I might do really well on 3 assessments, not so well on the 4th assessment, but overall, once we compute a combined score, my high scores on the previous 3 can compensate for my lower score on the 4th. And this approach is less useful for jobs in which specific talents must exist at a minimum level. And that is, if we have a minimum bar for each of the assessments because we believe they're important, then you can see how the compensatory approach becomes modified. So we could actually have a minimum bar score on each, turning each compensatory assessment, if you will, into like a mini hurdle. But we're getting pretty complex there. Let's just move on with a simpler example. Can also identify future training opportunities for candidates. So as we begin to build a candidate's portfolio, which will become an employee portfolio if they're hired, we can identify through these assessments perhaps some of the areas where, you know, you did really well in these 3 areas of our assessment process. The 4th you're a little light on, but we can provide you training once you've been hired to bump your skill level up in that area. Right? So executing the compensatory approach, well, unit weighting is giving multiple assessments equal weighting and computing an overall score, and that's essentially what we did in, homework 10, when we compared Christoph and Dahlia. We didn't weight their scores, we just computed them to z-scores, right? Now, rational weighting, this is where we give different assessment items different weights, right? It's a subjective weighting system typically, and the first place we go to is our subject matter experts, our SMEs, to say, well, of the 4 or 5 qualities that we're assessing with our 4 or 5 assessment measures, which do you believe relative to the others is more important, and how much weight should we give assessment number 1 versus assessment 2? Do we believe that assessment 1 is maybe 30% more important than assessment 2? Then let's weight those z-scores, right? Weight those z-scores such to reflect our belief in their importance. And notice this is really at the basis of opinion. Now, statistical weighting uses a statistical technique such as multiple regression to assign different weight to each assessment score, and really that can be derived from the judgment call on the basis of the SMEs. Now, multiple regression is the most scientific approach to determine how to weight each assessment in computing a candidate's overall score. And now what we're doing is we're looking at the predictive validity of the measures, but this is something that we do in multiple cycles. So we hire some people, we retain their assessment scores as part of their file, we hire folks, and then what do? We track their performance and how well did this assessment predict this aspect of their performance. And then we can work backwards at future assessment times when we're hiring new candidates. That is, we can use the data we've collected on performance as it correlates to assessment, and from there perhaps then change the weights so that our assessment process better predicts the necessary qualities of on-the-job performance. So, we're not done at developing the initial process. Continuous improvement dictates that we measure on-the-job performance and use those measures of on-the-job performance to subsequently modify, incrementally improve our assessment tools so that we continuously improve our hiring process. So let's just look here at an example of a unit-weighted approach. The candidate, right, so we have Dahlia and Christoph, and what do we look at? and maybe you're getting tired of looking at them. They had all these, 5 assessment processes, and we had the raw scores. We converted them to standardized scores, right? And then we, in fact, looked and saw that they were, in this example, tied at 6.3 overall score each. Now, that makes for a hiring dilemma because, unless we're hiring 2 people and they've excelled beyond all the other applicants, right? This is where we kind of left off. Now, notice there is no weighting to the standardized scores. We're using just the standardized scores. We're allowed to combine them, obviously, because they represent z-scores. Now, the statistical weighting approach, right, and for those of you who've had enough statistics to get through your linear regression, right, basically what we're doing is developing a regression equation. So now someone's overall score, right, is, and C is always a constant. We may or may not use a constant. It's not necessary in many instances, but it might make the numbers line up at a different level. But now what we do is B1 times A1, B2 times A2, B3 times A3. What we're looking at is what is the weight and what is the assessment score. So in this formula, the constant, the B's, are the same statistical weights applied to each assessment method to maximize the validity of the group of assessment methods. So again, we're trying to weight these scores to better predict who will do a good job. The overall score then, and what we see here is an example then, what is Dahlia or Christoph's overall score? Well, we take their interview score, their standard score, and we're going to weight it as 0.1. So notice that diminishes the power, right? And then we see the dexterity score we believe is more important, so we give it a weight of 0.3 rather than 0.1 on the interview. And what that implies is, based on our subject matter experts or observed job performance and working backwards from the correlations, we say that, hey, dexterity is actually 3 times more important than interview, so we're going to weight their dexterity score 3 times more than the interview score. And look at the knowledge, man. In this equation, we're thinking knowledge is pretty damn important. It's actually being weighted 5 times the interview score. Right, Annika? And what else do we have here? Well, 0.8 times performance, 0.2 times values. And note, the weights don't have to add up to 1. That's up to us. Now, for a lot of us, we like things to add up to 1. It makes it neater, but it's not necessary, right? As long as the weights are equally applied. So now, let's look at the statistical weighting approach in the table. What we have is we have the same table, but now what we've done is added a couple columns. So we know we're familiar with the raw scores for both Dahlia and Christoph, right? And then we created standardized scores, but now we're going to apply the weights. And we see the weights as were displayed in that equation: 0.1 for interview, 0.3 for dexterity, 0.5 for knowledge, 0.2 for values, and 0.8 for performance. We really like that performance assessment measure. So now we simply take their standard score, multiply it by the weight, right? And now we have their adjusted scores that we're going to combine. And look what happens in this example. Based on the weighting, that is which assessments we believe more predictive, more important than the others. Now, we had a tie before. We had 6.3 to 6.3, but with the weighting, what we see then is it appears that Christoph is emerging as a slight leader, 2.75 over Dahlia's 2.11. Okay? So the statistical weighting approach allows us, again, another tool in differentiating our candidates. And remember that these weights are generated by initially subject matter experts. Okay? If we have literature, and we're using a system of measures that were implied by some piece of literature right out there, then some empirically based literature, we might stick with their suggestion, or we might be using data collected on the job performance a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road that implies the importance of the assessment weights in predicting performance, so we do it in a more correlational, regressional fashion. Okay? So, To be most accurate, the statistical approach requires a sample of several hundred or more hires, a low intercorrelation among assessment methods, and a relatively small number of assessment methods. But fear not, we can still use the system violating most of those rules. Because the weights can differ when derived from different groups of people, it's best to check the stability of multiple regression equation in different groups to actually assess its effectiveness. And again, that might be a bridge too far for us in certain respects. Okay. If estimating the regression equation on large sample sizes is impossible, unit weighting or even rational weighting, and that is the rational weighting as developed by the suggestion of Smees, it might be a better choice. Okay. So again, statistics, functions best when we have large numbers, but that's not to say that we can't incorporate our judgment into the statistical process. Validity can sometimes be enhanced by combining multiple regression approach with global expert judgments. And that's conceivable as well. Now, in our assignment, we're going to use, I believe, the best way is going to be, you guys are going to be subject matter experts and supply your own weights. So, combining multiple hurdles and compensatory approach, well, okay. Often some job requirements, like I said earlier, there's essential aspects of job performance. Oh, Annika, I don't think you should be doing that. Whatever it is you're doing, I have a feeling you're going to turn off the camera any minute now. I'm sorry for this, you guys, but she's been really jacked. Annika, come here. Come here. She's just full of it right now. All right. So, a data entry hire may need to type a certain number of words per minute with a minimum number of errors, which should be a minimum hurdle. So that might be something, in that occupation, we might say, look, we have to have someone who can do 60 words a minute, and we can't have an hour, an error rate of higher than 0.1. And that's just where we're at, right? So use that as a hurdle, have people come in, demonstrate that, and those people who pass then can be scheduled into an assessment center. Here, do you want to play with this or something? I know, you want your ribbon. Here. You guys, this is the dumbest toy ever. Annika, this ribbon, they love ribbon, so there you go. Now Sushi's not interested because I want her to be. So you can see how we can set up hurdle approach, and then the typing test can be used at the beginning of the assessment process as the hurdle. We weed out the people who can't meet the minimum typing requirement. Then the compensatory approach, balancing cognitive ability and personality, can be used on those candidates that are left having jumped the hurdle, so to speak. Now, final choice, well, the cut score. There may be, in fact, we have decided, based on our past experience, we hired some people who were below this score and they just didn't work out. And that might justify the employment then of a cut score, right? So we saw with Christoph and Dahlia, we had 2.11 and 2.75, if I'm not mistaken, in their weighted final scores. We might say, hey, 0.200 is a minimum cut score. What we're saying is if we run 20, 30, 40 candidates through and no one attains the level of 0.20, everyone's below it, then we're not going to hire anyone and we're going to have to go back to square one, recruit new candidates and run it over again. So sometimes this cut score says, look, there's a minimum bar to achieve, and if none of the candidates achieve that minimum bar in the assessment center, then we hire no one and we start over again. Rank ordering, well, that's what we're all about in this course since the beginning of time, is ranking candidates from the highest to the lowest score. And, we may have X number of people above the cut score, then how many we hire is dictated by our original intent. Now, banding, and notice we can apply banding. We could say, look, anyone who scores in our assessment center the weighted score, and Christoph was at 2.75, so we can say anyone who scores between 2.9 and 2.7, right, is essentially equal. They're within the same band, so we're free to choose any candidate within that band over another because we've grouped them in a band. So what we're saying is it's close enough that all else being equal, the candidates between 2.7 on their weighted score and 2.9 really are equal. And this might be a reasonable assumption. If we look, if each of the assessment measures has a small degree of error in it, right? That is just normal variability within each measure. Then we say, look, you know, if there's this much error in assessment 1 and this much error in assessment 2 and this much error in assessment 3, when it gets down to the practical analysis of the sum of all 5 assessments, thinking in terms of the error, you know, someone who's got a 2.75 is really indistinguishable from someone who has a 2.85, that they're not really statistically significantly different. And we're going to stay away from the statistics to understand that little statement there. But hiring within the band is done randomly or based on other factors. And notice that when we band now, one of the advantages to banding is we may then say, look, these 5 people are in the same band. We need to hire 2. These people in this band are essentially equal, given the standard error of measurement, etc. Do some of these candidates then fulfill our diversity efforts where some don't? And really, at this point, what we're saying is these people are equal. These 5 people are equal. So how do we decide? Well, we could roll the dice, you know, and just randomly choose. Or if maybe some of these people support our diversity efforts, then maybe we should go with that nod at that point in time. Banding allows for consideration of other factors making that final choice. Imagine that the assessment, and this assessment should be applied to anyone who wants this position, whether they're an external or internal candidate. But let's suppose that we have 3 external candidates and 2 internal candidates who are within the same band. Well, if promoting people from within, that is giving people who've worked hard for us additional opportunities, then maybe we want to go with those internal candidates, right? Maybe not, but again, within the band, these kind of judgments can be made. Bandwidths are generally calculated on the basis of the standard error of measurement, as I was discussing. So the final choice, when using cut scores or rank ordering, an additional decision needs to be made whether to hire from the top of the list down or to create a pool of finalists from which to make a final choice. So are we going to go with strict rank ordering, or look at this band as representing a pool of candidates? The pool of finalists can be rank ordered on global or specific assessments, selected randomly, banded. There's no one method, so feel free to kind of deviate there. Whenever possible, the ability of the assessment scores to predict job success should be carefully evaluated. So we're always looking at measures down the road, and how did our assessment scores correlate with those measures? We don't know how close Annika came to knocking the camera over. The cat is frickin' possessed right now. All right. So, cutoff score should be set high enough to ensure that new hires are likely to meet or exceed the minimum standards of success. Wow. All right. I know it sounds like a lot, but if you sit with it a couple minutes, it's really straightforward and just a continuation of where we've been. So, let us then move through homework 10 and 11 to homework 12. And what we have here in this activity, take data from homework 11 and assign weights to each measure, calculate adjusted weights on the 5 assessments for both candidates. So, what we had in homework 11 was the possible measures, right? For whichever position we were working on. Teaching was a great example. So you have the standardized scores. This is just the old stuff. So this is what we completed in homework 11, right? Now, re-enter your data. So when you get to homework 12, what you're going to see is, and homework 12, I know, the assignment. Oh my God, who would ever think that the homework 12 assignment, just the assignment that I wrote for you guys, is 8 pages? right? But it contains a lot of tables, and what I wanted to do is walk you through it step by step. So what are you going to do here? Well, notice, we got Dahlia, right? And you're going to fill this in because you did the Dahlia and Christoph thing, so put in their standardized scores. Their first step. So let's take it a step further. Now we're going to weight each item to reflect its perceived importance, and you guys can go ahead and read through these instructions. So in the example below, I've created weights based on my perceived importance. So that's something your team's going to have to do, is look at those measures. And remember, each of you had a measure that you worked on, was kind of find a measure. So each of you chose a measure for our teachers, right? And then you went out and you looked for a measure and you looked at the data on that. Well, basically what you're going to do then, standardized interview, one of your measures, whichever it is, weight them. So I would assume if you have 4 team members, you had 4 measures from that assignment. Now you got to discuss amongst yourself, what should the weights of these measures be, right? Now I've done it, and you know me, I like to be orderly, so what I did here is 0.1, 0.3, 0.1, 0.3, 0.2 on these measures. I pretended I was a subject matter expert, and I just plugged those numbers in. So if you'd like an equation form, then you can put it in an equation form, and my equation would be constant, which could be 0, it doesn't matter, plus 0.1 interview, 0.3 work product, notice that came from the previous table, 0.1 knowledge, 0.3 problem, and 0.2 persistent. You can see where SMEs and existing empirically supported literature might be helpful to determine these weights. How you get at it, right? So, let's move on to completing the example here, so you guys can just move through your homework. Then fill it out with Dahlia's previously calculated standard score. So this is just for Dahlia, right? Here is the 5 measures, right? You're going to fill in the standardized scores, which we've already computed. We already know those. And then you're going to take the weights that you've assigned. These are the weights in my example. And then you're going to develop the weighted score. What you end up with is a total standard score and a total weighted score. Okay. Like we've seen several examples. Do the same for Christoph. So here's Christoph's table that's in the homework. And notice I give you both tables in the homework, so you just got to fill them out. Use weighted scores just computed. Do we make the same hiring decision as we did with the unweighted standard scores in homework 11? Do we? So I've supplied you the weighted scores here. Just work through the math, right? So this is the Dahlia example. Here's the Christoph example, but guess what? Now that you've just worked through this example, you're going to provide your own. So please go to your teaching example in homework 7. Do the same for the find and measure portion of that assignment from each of your team members. Ultimately, you need at least 3 scores, but you're likely to have 4 or 5. So my example, right? But yours, you guys each identified a quality out of that teaching example, right? Well, now's your time to put them all together. So, create the weighted assessment scores from a repertory grid in homework 7 and validating correlation homework 10 assignments. Okay? So you got to use them, you got to put it all together, put in the assessment name, range of possible scores, the observed statistical deviation, right? If you used empirically validated measure, you likely have range of scores possible, you likely have a mean, and you likely have a standard deviation. So as you're preparing to fill out that table, using my patience measure as an example, it had 102 items. The score range was 0 to 102. Range of measure. The mean I've made up is 78. Standard deviation is 7.8. And again, if there's no standard deviation supplied, I would just then multiply the mean by 0.1, and that's going to give you a rough, reasonable standard deviation to work through the assignment. Ultimately, this is what I need though. Patience measure, it's named, its range, its mean, its standard deviation. So, the above allows me to create standardized scores for an individual applicant. Remember, to create a standard score, we need mean and standard deviation. So, this is what you get to fill out then. Okay, so now you have the information to fill out this table. And notice, this is just an interim table, so that this is the way we're working at this, is kind of just a step at a time, right? But each of you will then fill in one of these boxes. So the assessment name that you develop from the repertory grid and subsequent assignments, the score range, and if it was an empirically, like I said, if it was an empirically based measure, then the score range should be in that empirical literature you found, the assessment, the sample mean of the people they gave it to, and then the standard deviation. So at this point, you're really just replacing my placeholders with that information as indicated here, and notice there'll be, I don't know, 4 or 5 rows for you to fill this out. Now, then you get together with your group and you say, hey, let's weight these assessment scores, so you'll supply the weights, and that's simply determined by your group. If you want the weights to add up to 1, that's fine. If you want to add them to 10, it doesn't matter. That's just, the weights really indicate the importance of one assessment relative to another. So here, you're taking your individual work, you guys, you're putting it all in one table, and then you're going to use that table to fill this table. So, the assessment name, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how many ever there are, the raw score for Quincy on this, right? The standardized score. So, the raw score is something that you supply, right? If you're using a measure that's 0 to 20 and you want to be, if Quincy did a good job, give him an 18, right? Develop the standardized score, develop the weight, and then develop the weighted score. So what we're doing is we're developing a weighted score for Quincy from our assessment center. And this is simply to give you practice from putting this in a tabular format, from assigning weights, and understanding how the mean, standard deviation yield the standardized score, right? So, and you'll notice then, of course, there's going to be a difference between the standard score, the z-score, the combined z-score, and the total weighted score. Okay? And that's it. A copy of this sheet would be used for each applicant and maintained in the personnel hiring files, right? This sheet here. So this is ultimately the sheet. And notice we had similar sheets in our example for Christoph and Dahlia. So really, I know it looks like a lot, you guys, but just take it a piece at a time and complete this piece, and then add on the increment that's required to create the next piece from the previous piece, right? Sharing this with an applicant, think about it, yields a transparent view of the hiring process. So if someone says, well, okay, so I wasn't hired, and you say, okay, so on the basis of our assessment, these were your raw scores, this was the standardized scores, we standardize those scores, and then we weight the scores on the basis of their perceived importance, right? And then this was your weighted score. The idea is to be transparent, the idea is to be fair, and this allows us to accomplish both, right? So, this then really kind of provide for a conversation on the potential for areas of improvement at that point, and say, look, I'm sorry, but you know, if you want to apply next year, we'll be hiring next year if you want to apply. These are the areas probably where you could kind of bump up your game if you so choose. But anyway, thank you. And guys, this is it. This is the end. So this is your final assignment. And note, as we see in this course, every assignment kind of builds on the last assignment. So we have been leading to this point basically since the first day of the course, strangely enough. And damn, I wish we could have done this in person. And next spring, yeah, it looks like we'll likely be doing this in person. But until then, I wish you all the best, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.